There are elements in Israel that one could define as Jewish extremists / terrorists. I know that with the COVID crisis that several ultra-Orthodox communities have been anything but helpful.
Like you can't deter Al-Qaeda or you can't deter ISIS, but Hezbollah and Hamas you can deter because they have something to lose.
There's no foreseeable end to this threat.
Absolutely, and because that I sort of talk about 30 years wars, which may become 100 years wars.
Hi, my name is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, a podcast about all things national security. I've had the pleasure of traveling to Israel. I have met with Israeli authorities, both within the Shin Bet and the Mossad, in my past as an intelligence analyst for Canada. And I have an appreciation for the types of threats that country faces and the job that Israel's protectors, i.e. their security, intelligence services, and military, have on their plate on a daily basis. But I am anything but an expert on Israel proper. And so I thought it would be a really, really good idea to bring into the conversation Joshua Krasna, who is a senior researcher, writer, and university lecturer. He retired in 2017 after 30 years of government service in Israel, including as a strategic planner, a senior Middle East and strategic analyst, etc., etc. He actually was also a diplomat. He worked as a counselor at the Israeli embassy here in Ottawa, here in Canada, and is now a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and an adjunct assistant professor at the New York University Center for Global Affairs. So Josh, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start out with the easy questions now. From your perspective, in 2020, what are the most serious national security threats that Israel faces?
So, can I change your word threats to challenges?
Absolutely.
Because I think the first interesting thing, and perhaps sounds counterintuitive to people who sort of hear a lot of Israelis talking, is that I think that Israel's national security is probably close to the best it's ever been. I think that since 1973, at the time we didn't know it, but in 1973, the dangers to Israel's security hit their peak. And I think since 1973, and more so since the 1990s, I think Israel has become objectively more and more secure.
So 73, that of course is the October crisis, the October War, 73.
The October War. And then for a while after that, Israel was spending 30% of its GDP on defense. But already since the early 2000s, we spend an average of 6 to 7% a year on defense. So that's a tremendous
that's a significant, that's a significant decrease.
That's right. And by the way, the amount hasn't changed so much, but what's happened over time is that our economy has grown tremendously. And other things that have happened, of course, over those almost 50 years is we signed a peace treaty with Egypt, which is our biggest military threat, and that peace treaty has maintained itself and stayed in place for 40 years. We signed in 1994 peace treaty with Jordan, which means that our two longest borders, that with Jordan and that with Egypt, are with countries who we have peace with. And that led to a tremendous peace dividend, both in terms of defense spending, but also in terms of our being able to, decrease the investment of manpower and treasure facing those two fronts, and therefore able to face our other fronts more significantly. And then, of course, 2003, the Iraqi threat, which had always been sort of the main second-tier threat to Israel, disappeared because Iraq basically collapsed. And then the Iraq that is now being reconfigured, Israel is not one of their main criteria at all. And our last major state enemy, which was Syria, starting in 2011, is very, very much engrossed in itself and has become even less of a threat to Israel. So that's even before I reach what our three big challenges are now. I would just say that that in terms of our overall relationships in the region, and the overall balance of power and balance of force in the region, I think that we're in a much better place we've been in the past. Um, sorry, yeah,
That's indeed very, very good news because, as I said it in the introduction, I mean, Israel was faced with that. Let's face it, it was an existential threat dating back to
yes,
the creation of the country in 1948. And as you said, most of the inimical neighbors that you've dealt with have essentially either signed peace treaties or no longer face a threat. Just quickly, Joshua, before you talk about challenges, do you see these neighbors and partners? Well, I wouldn't call them partners. Do you see these peace treaties that have been signed with the neighbors sort of? Are they going to be maintained? Because I worry about Egypt under Sisi. Do you see perhaps Egypt returning to a position at some point in the future where they will no longer see Israel as, or they will see Israel once again as a potential foe?
yeah. So I think that first of all, yes, they're partners, right? It's not just peace treaties; it's actual partnership. And the Egyptians have been surprisingly good partners um, over the past 40 years, which is, think of it, they went through a revolution, right? Um, the person who signed the peace treaty with us was killed. His successor ruled the country for 30 years, Mubarak.
Mm-hmm.
He
Mubarak.
he he fell. He was replaced by a government which was almost the exact opposite, right? A government of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that
Mm-hmm.
government, in the year that it was in power, didn't challenge the peace treaty with Israel at all,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact was quite helpful to us as a significant interlocutor between us and Hamas, because we don't engage with Hamas directly, and we need interlocutors who can both provide good offices and send messages and all of that, but who also are significant and strong enough in terms of Hamas for Hamas to listen to them. And Egypt has been fulfilling that role very well before the revolution, since the revolution, and to this day. And yes, I'm sorry. And Egypt also has been facing a very serious ISIS affiliated threat in the Sinai, and in
Mm-hmm.
fact has developed very significant security intelligence and even military cooperation with Israel in addressing that threat. So I think up until now, um, the peace treaty with Egypt has been a really good investment, and as I said, has had several significant challenges, right? We signed the peace treaty in 79. We went to war in Lebanon in 82.
Mm-hmm.
The Egyptians weren't that happy, but didn't do anything. We've had various two intifadas where we were in a struggle with popular struggle with the Palestinians. Um, we had two changes of government in Egypt, and the peace treaty is still pretty robust. So and one other thing, I'm sorry, Phil, just to sort of give you a complete answer. And the other thing that's happened to Egypt since the 1970s is that Egypt has become a country that militarily is tremendously dependent on the United States, and that is something that gives us sort of a cushion of comfort, which is very significant. Because if Egypt decided tomorrow that it was going to change its attitude towards Israel and take a more belligerent military attitude towards Israel, it would be not only a change its attitude to Israel, but it would be an entire change of its orientation in terms of being a country which is allied to the United States and which is basically the United States is its main military supplier.
I think those are excellent points, Joshua. Because as we know, the Egypt, I guess, prior to Sadat, or even in Sadat's day, was seen more or less as a Soviet client, if my history is correct. And I don't disagree with you. I think that Egypt, whatever you think of the Sisi government and whatever you think of the Muslim Brotherhood, they are struggling with an economy that is completely in tatters, partly because of COVID, partly for other reasons, as well as you mentioned the Islamic State in the Sinai, which people forget is actually one of the more lethal Islamic State affiliates in recent years in terms of
Yes.
attacks against Egyptian forces, attacks against tourist sites. So, getting back to that first question, then you said you'd rather see this more in terms of not national security threats, but challenges. So, what are those challenges from your perspective?
So I think the preeminent challenge, and the one I can really define as a national security threat, is the potential of Iran becoming a nuclear power and the reality of Iran playing a anti-Israeli and destabilizing role in the region, right? So if we look and we say, okay, what are the major national security concerns of Israel? That is the top one. But you were discussing existential threats before. It's not an existential threat now, right? If Iran achieved capability of developing nuclear weapons and the abilities to deliver those weapons, that could be a theoretical existential threat to Israel. So right now we have a potential existential threat, and we have activity in the region which is of concern with us because it strengthens our enemies. And that will be, let's say, my second challenge or threat, which is that Israel faces um, long wars, that it's basically two 30-year wars, right? One with Hezbollah and one with Hamas. And these are wars which are, if we look at Israeli history, right, in terms of casualties and in terms of disruption, are low intensity conflicts, but they are conflicts that seem to be fairly insoluble. In other words, we're fighting 30-year wars of attrition with two um, non-state actors, right? It's hard to call them non-state. Maybe I'll address that in a minute. Two actors who are sub-state actors who are constantly generating a threat and constantly bleeding us as well, but certainly don't pass the ceiling, right? The threshold of being uh, um, existential or even extremely serious national security threats,
Mm-hmm.
right? In other words, they are threats that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They are our major day-to-day threat. They are an extremely challenging, versatile, and resilient adversary, but we're not talking about Egypt between 1948 and 1973, right? Or Syria, between 1973 and the late 80s. We're not talking about a country or combination of countries that has the ability to destroy the state of Israel. Um, we're talking about actors who are certainly a significant military challenge and who certainly have the ability to disrupt normal life in Israel and to, of course, um, to the extent that the sort of cold or warm wars with them turn hot, to inflict significant amount of casualties on Israeli forces. But
There are also groups with which it's impossible to sit down at a table and negotiate peace in the same sense that you did with Egypt in
uh,
1979. In that sense, then there's no foreseeable end to this threat. Then
absolutely. And because that, I sort of talk about 30 years wars, which may become 100 years wars, right? Because
wow.
they are wars that if you've been in Israel, certainly been in Israel in recent years, right? Our normal life runs, the same as always says. We're a country that's doing right now badly because of COVID, but in general, doing very well economically, doing very well technologically, developing a civil society. But all of that while we have these two sort of running sores, which aren't going away anytime soon. And as you said, Israel's sort of military strategy in the past has always been based on, we'll have a sharp, short war, and then we'll have peace for a long period. So,
Mm-hmm.
that is impossible to achieve with these two these two adversaries, even though both of them, as I said, are almost semi-state actors. Why?
Right.
Hamas is in fact the government of the Gaza Strip, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hamas is a near state actor, right? It has territory, it has a government, it has an army. Um, to the Hamas in the Gaza is pretty much a near state adversary, right?
Right.
Hamas as a terrorist organization inside Israel or in the West Bank, which thank goodness, and I'm knocking here on wood, right, has
Mm-hmm.
not been very active in the past years. But remember that between 2000 and 2004, we lost 1,500 Israeli casualties, Israeli killed
Mm-hmm.
in the
Right.
second Intifada. But for now has been fairly quiescent there. There it is national security, policing, insurgency, counterterrorism threat. Hezbollah also, while Hezbollah is not the government of Lebanon, Hezbollah is the most powerful force militarily and politically in Lebanon, and is of course
Absolutely.
backed up by Iran, which is our most significant adversary. So Hezbollah in Lebanon is also a near state actor with a near army that's that is standing by, and a very well armed army. But because both Hamas and Hezbollah, because they are near state actors, they have territory, they have governmental structures, the principles of deterrence do work with them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sorry.
No.
Like you can't
I,
deter Al Qaeda or you can't deter ISIS, but Hezbollah and Hamas you can deter because they have something to lose.
exactly. We talked about the seminal event of the signing of peace, back in '79 with Egypt, and Israel obviously has benefited greatly from its allies around the world, of which Canada, of course, is one. But your biggest ally is and always will be, I think, the United States. In the waning days of the Trump administration, the Americans brokered peace deals between Israel and three Arab states:
Mm-hmm.
Bahrain, the UAE, and Sudan. Part of me says this is just the Trump administration trying to, I don't know, do something high profile. Do these peace treaties really matter for Israel? And will it really make a difference in terms of Israel's national security, Joshua?
So first, I want to be precise. There are two peace treaties. The one with Sudan has not yet been completed. In fact, in January or February, our prime minister met with Burhan, who's the head of the Military Transitional Committee, um, in Uganda. About they spoke about normalization, and then, of course, a month ago or 2 months ago, Pompeo again spoke about normalization, and it's a little bit of a Polish wedding with Sudan. It's sort of it's and part of it, of course, is because of the situation in Sudan. But we'll put
Right.
that aside. Certainly, the the impetus, right? The seems to be very, very positive. And I think that is very important to Israeli national security. I think, sort of going back to what we were discussing before, I think if I look at the Middle East now, I see that states that are enemy to Israel, right? Enemy states, there are two and two halves, right? There's Iran and Syria, certainly enemy states. There is Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? The the state of Lebanon is not an enemy of Israel. I mean, it's defined such legally, but it doesn't act like an enemy of Israel. In fact, we're negotiating with them right now about the maritime border. Hezbollah is an enemy, and Hamas in Gaza, right? But if I had looked at it, if 30 years ago, or certainly 40 years ago, I had looked at you and told me that the two countries that are still enemies of Israel are Syria and Iran, I probably would have signed off on that happily. And
Mm.
now what's going on is that many of the countries that over the years have been in sort of this position of not friend but not enemy, right? We only had three uh, um, uh, um, polities in the Middle East that signed peace treaties with Israel: Egypt, Jordan, but also the Palestinian Authority, right?
Right.
The Palestinian Authority came into being because of an agreement between Israel and the PLO.
Hmm.
So right now, those relations aren't very good. But Israel recognized the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority recognizes Israel. So I'm saying so, and then for a long time there was nothing, right? In 2019 we celebrated 25 years to the Jordanian peace treaty, and think of it, since 2014 there had not been a single peace agreement between since 1994 there had been a single
Hmm.
peace agreement between Israel and Arab countries. So we reached the stage where we are no longer at war with people, but we weren't moving past that. And I think that the UAE and Bahrain, well, the UAE and Bahrain in themselves are very small countries with very small populations. Um, the native Bahrainis and Emiratis are a minority in their country. They are not, well, I shouldn't say that, UAE is. They have not been until recently movers and shakers in the Arab world, but they have recognized Israel as totally normal relations, right? And think of it, with Egypt, there was territorial component, right? We had to give something, we had to get something back. With Jordan, there was less for territorial, but we were neighboring countries. And here we've reached out to countries who don't neighbor with us, and those countries have now formalized this sort of alliance of interest they've been developing with Israel, certainly since 2000, beginning in 2003 with the fall of the Iraq and the expansion of Iranian influence in the region, jumping forward in 2011 with the Arab uprisings and their need to build a conservative bloc in the Middle East, and to deal with the Iranians trying to utilize the unrest in the Arab world, and succeeding in Iraq and in Syria, and to a certain extent in Libya. And of course, what began already in the second Bush administration, but continued through the Obama administration and hit a peak in 2015, which is the United States sort of changing its orientation, wanting to disengage, wanting to pull its troops back. 2015, you have the nuclear deal, which really pushed Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel into a very close political alliance and a very activist political coordination. And then, of course, starting 2016, where Trump administration, which on the one hand is a very positive administration in their point of view in terms of their interests, but on the other hand is not interested in the Middle East and wants to disengage. So there was this coming together in any case of sort of like-minded states. But now the UAE and Bahrain have jumped forward on that. And now it's already formal. And it's not formal with the Saudis, and it won't be formal for a while with the Saudis. But it's fairly clear to anyone in the region that Israel and Saudi Arabia are no longer adversaries. Right? If they're anything, they're friends.
I'm glad you raised the whole Saudi angle, Joshua. Do you think it's just a matter of time before Saudi Arabia and Israel enter into a peace treaty?
Yes.
Or relations, rather?
Yes, but a matter of time is always a great way to put it, because it doesn't tell me how much time. So I think that the two countries have a lot of interests, and I think they don't have a lot of things which they disagree on. And I think Mohammed bin Salman would be very interesting in formalizing that relationship. I think unlike UAE and Bahrain, Saudi Arabia is a big country, and therefore there are important constituencies which don't necessarily agree with formalizing relationship with Israel. And I think that Mohammed bin Salman himself has not completed what seems to be his takeover of the Saudi political system. He is not king yet, and there are still people in the family who might not want him to be king yet. And his father, by the way, sometimes intervenes to sort of let's say, bring him back to line when he gets too far ahead of himself on the Palestinian issue, for instance. So I think that while there's tremendous coincidence of interest, you can even perhaps call it an alignment of interests. And while Saudi Arabia has gone pretty far, I mean, Israeli planes can now overfly Saudi Arabia. Saudis and Israelis at this point are meeting, and they're not they're not scared to meet anymore. And the Bahrainis, for instance, would not have made peace, would not have signed a formal treaty with Israel without the agreement of the Saudis. And I don't think, by the way, Sudan would have gone into it without the agreement of the Saudis and the UAE. I think Saudi Arabia is not going to be the next country, or maybe even the one after that. I think, as I said, there are domestic constituencies. There's the leadership role that they play in the Arab world, where I'm not sure that they want to go that far. I think that until Mohammed bin Salman solidifies his political power, I don't think he wants to do something that might be received badly in the region and inside Saudi Arabia. But I think he's going to go right up to the line of formalizing relations. Talking about normal relations and formal relations, I think normal relations we're pretty close to. I think formal relations is going to be a bridge too far at the moment.
Hmm. Well, I certainly understand why it would be in Israel's interest to attract a power such as Saudi Arabia, as you said, a lot bigger than Bahrain and UAE, which are small Gulf states, wields an enormous amount of influence in the Arab world and the Muslim world. Although I would push back a little bit and wonder why, a state would embrace someone being led by a man who likes to, dismember journalists in Turkey. But that's a whole other issue, I suppose. Let's turn the conversation a little bit inward, Joshua, if that's okay.
Sure.
We certainly, I don't disagree with you that when it comes to the challenges as you frame it
Oh,
that
by the way,
Israel has.
there's a third challenge which you asked me for three, and I didn't.
Oh, right,
The,
sure, go right ahead.
the third challenge is maintaining um, a robust and very friendly and very deep strategic alliance with the United States,
Mhm.
which is not.
and given the fact we now have a new president, that
That's
we
right.
have Joe Biden as the president, is that looking optimistic on that front as well?
So I think that Israel has a deep and very wide relationship with the United States, both with Democrats and Republicans. However, and I think the military relationship is very good. However, I think that yes, the government of Israel has some work cut out for him. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very closely associated with President Trump. Has made no bones of the fact that he enjoyed working with Trump and that he wanted Trump to be reelected. So I think that we have some work cut out for us in trying to show that we know how to be bipartisan. It's a muscle that we haven't that our bipartisan muscle atrophied under Obama, and certainly atrophied even more under Trump. And I think we need to work. It's a significant challenge to make sure that we still manage to have a good relationship and a robust and visibly positive relationship with the White House and with the United States. It's not impossible. It's something that we certainly can do, but we're going to have to put some effort into it.
In other words, I think there's things that the Netanyahu government probably took for granted under the Trump administration that it can't no longer do so under a Biden one. Is that the way you would frame it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
But also, Biden and especially the other Democrats are coming in knowing that Netanyahu um, was not particularly helpful or friendly under Obama, and has been one of Trump's closest international allies.
Right. Right. So let me turn the conversation to another, what I would call a challenge for Israel. I'm not sure if you would agree with me on this. And there's no question that in terms of threats to public safety and national security, Hezbollah and Hamas are definitely the two greatest terrorist actors. And one's against, as we said earlier, there's no hope of actually downing tools on this one because neither party, neither the Hezbollahis or the Hamasis, are going to want to actually recognize Israel and deal with it. What about Israeli internal policies? And here I'm turning to what's happening in the West Bank. Particularly, there's an announcement the other day where new settlements are being announced in the West Bank, which some have said definitely undermines any kind of territorial integrity for the Palestinians. And I guess more narrowly, Joshua, uh, Jewish extremism, which again, I'm not equating to Islamist extremism. It pales in comparison, but there are elements in Israel that one could define as Jewish extremists slash terrorists. I know that with the COVID crisis, that several ultra orthodox communities have been anything but helpful in not abiding by good practices to stop the spread of COVID-19. How important is this aspect of Jewish life in Israel? And can the Netanyahu government, which my understanding has relied in many ways, because it's always a minority government and many coalitions in Israel, has relied on the support of the ultra Orthodox and what I call Jewish extremists. Can anything be done on that front? Or is it simply politics gets in the way?
So I'm gonna break this down a little bit because I think it's important. So first of all, I want to separate the idea of Jewish extremism from ultra Orthodox. Right? Ultra Orthodox are no one's quite sure, but say probably 10 to 15% of the population. Um, they are organized politically. They're part of our country. In other words, um, we might not like everything they do. They but they're not an anti-state force as such, right? They are a political constituency and a social constituency, by the way, poor, impoverished constituency, which has to be addressed. And we can like them or not like them. They the Even when they are violent, it is not something that we could bring to the level of extremism or terror, right? Now there is Jewish extremism in Israel. It's it's on the far right in Israel. Very much the far right politics blend into religious messianism, which, by the way, is not the ultra orthodox. It's a certain element of what we call the modern Orthodox community, much more than the ultra Orthodox community.
Oh, thanks for the clarification. I did not know that.
Right. And the interesting thing there is that that group. Those groups existed. In 2015, they committed a horrific murder of a Palestinian family in the town of Duma. The interesting thing that happened after that, of course, was that the Shabak, right, the Israeli security agency, the government declared that the people who carried out those attacks, and attacks by Jewish extremists against Palestinian civilians, were terror. And the Shabak went out and, using the tools that it had developed to deal with Arab terror, arrested the people, found the people, arrested them, and one of them was a few weeks ago sentenced to life imprisonment. So I would say that sort of the sine wave of Jewish extremism hit its real peak actually quite some time ago, which is, of course, when our prime minister was murdered.
Right.
Yitzhak Rabin, 1995, 25 years ago, almost exactly, last week, was murdered by a right-wing Jewish extremist. And the reaction since then has been such that there is very little tolerance, even on the political right in Israel, for acts of violence. Now, I'm going to be precise, against Jews, right?
Right.
There is a certain level all the time of extremist violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, less against Arab Israelis, because despite a lot of things, despite what a lot of people think, Arab Israelis in Israel have full rights, and therefore a crime committed against them is considered a crime committed against anybody else. It will be investigated by a police, and they'll find the people. I think one of the things that we're most worried about right now is so there is these marginal Jewish extremist groups who do carry out attacks against Palestinian targets in the West Bank. It's decreased very much over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years. What we are more worried about now, actually, and if you're talking about Jewish right-wing extremism, actually has to do with the political disagreements in the country. Because, as you know, many people on the center and the left have begun to have demonstrations against Netanyahu, wanting Netanyahu to resign, wanting the government to fall. And the reaction of many of Netanyahu's supporters in the Likud has been extremely violent. Violent in terms of language, also violent in terms of sort of street violence, not use of arms and not use of killing, but all the major figures in the anti-Netanyahu movement have received death threats, as have many senior people in the judicial branch, because part of the right's effort to against the anti-Netanyahu forces is to discredit the judicial branch and say that the judicial branch is too activist, discredit the what's it called, the prosecution service, and our state attorneys. Many of them have to have, including our attorney general, have full-time security because they are under threat by right-wing extremists. But this is sort of within the context of Israeli politics. One of the interesting things is that, unlike the United States, where politics, right-wing politics, will of course play into racism and racial politics, in Israel, as I say, some of this is directed against Arab Israelis, very little. It's mostly directed, it's much more on the political than on the racial level. In other words, there's a lot of verbal violence and online violence and even some real violence and death threats, things like that, directed against the political left and center, the anti-Netanyahu camp. And that right now is actually a fairly significant issue. But again, the the nature of the kind of threat that I know they've seen in the United States, and that you've seen to a certain extent in Canada. We sort of hit our high point of that 25 years ago, and today there's less of that.
You strike me as optimistic, generally speaking, Joshua, when it comes to Israel's threats. You talk about the fact that, obviously the neighbors more or less are getting along. You've signed, recognition treaties with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, and perhaps one day the Sudanese. You portray Hamas and Hezbollah as serious threats, but clearly not existential ones an Israel can manage. And then you've just basically walked me through, the internal strife within Israel. Would that be a mistake for me to say that overall you're looking at the national security / public safety situation in Israel as of, mid-November 2020 as generally in a good place?
But yes, it would be a bit. So when we're discussing from the narrow view of national security, I think yes. I think we have a serious problem in Israel today with social solidarity. I think the break between right and left in politics, by the way, very similar to that in the United States,
Very
is
much so.
quite worrisome, because I think for perhaps one of the first times, or one of the very few times in the Israeli history, I think we're suffering a breakdown of social solidarity. People view people who on the other side, the people on either extreme, but I'm not talking about the far extremes, far extreme right and stuff. I'm talking sort of the extreme of the mainstream, right? People on the right of the Netanyahu supporters, and people on the left of the Netanyahu non-supporters. I think very much at this point are don't see each other as legitimate, and I think that's a problem. In other words, I think that one of the things that we've always that's always been strong in Israel is a feeling of social solidarity and social resilience, and I think that may be breaking down. And that's a concern on the national level, and of course, national security is broadly defined, though not security in the aspects that we're discussing here. And I think the breakdown in general, and again, not that different from the one that you see south of you, the breakdown in general of respect for rule of law, and the breakdown in respect for the need to have a competent and objective civil service, and the need to be able to understand that we need to reach across the aisle, and occasionally certain things require bipartisan cooperation. Yes, we're not in a good place in those things, and 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 one other thing, of course, is that in Israel right now, we view Turkey as a fairly serious challenge. Not a national security challenge specifically, but a challenge to other interests that we have in the region. Certainly, gas interests and our strategic cooperation with Greece and Cyprus.
Well, there's no question the Erdogan government has been a pain in the ass for many people, and it is extremely worrisome, the sort of ethno-nationalism that he's engaged in.
That's right.
Listen, Joshua, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm really glad we ended on that note of the lack of civil discourse and the lack of people's ability, both in your country and mine, United States, etc., to agree to disagree, at least if not peacefully, at least without getting to that
Without
violent fringe.
without rancor, I think is the issue.
Exactly. And I do think that there are a lot of people are very concerned about the rise of violence from that perspective. But this has been a very wide-ranging conversation on, security issues as seen through an Israeli lens. I do respect you for, the past you have as a practitioner with the Israeli government. And I do want to just remind my listeners as well, I neglected to mention that you're also an instructor in the Security, Economics, and Technology program at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, which I'm the director of. And if people want to take your courses, they simply have to go to the Ottawa U website and find out and sign up for them. So, Joshua, we could have talked for hours. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me, Phil. It's been very interesting.
That was my conversation with Josh Krasna. He was in Modi'in, Israel, just outside of Tel Aviv. What do you think about Israel and Israel's challenges? You can drop me a line on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, simply go to my website, borealisthreatrisk.com, find a subscribe button, provide your email address. You'll get a free daily digest of all the podcasts, all the blogs, first thing in the morning to your inbox, free of charge. Love to hear what you thought of this podcast and others. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.